There we go. Okay. So, if the first is a necessary existent only contingently, then the first wouldn't be a necessarily existent at all. It doesn't make sense to say this thing necessarily exists, but it might not have been necessarily existent, because necessary means it cannot not have been existent. See?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a contradiction, and that means that we have to left on the other one. It has to be this other whatness that is contingent, right? God might have been good only contingently, right? But then, goodness wouldn't be the whatness of the first, because you can't say that it's something's essence and it might not have been that, right? I can't say that, well, what God is a good being, and then in fact I can say, but he might not have been good, because if it's the case that he might not have been good, then that's not what his whatness is, that's not his essence, right? For example, now if I say that the essence of water is H2O, I can't say that this water might not have been H2O, because that means that it's not the essence of the water. If it wasn't H2O, it wouldn't have been that water, because that's what water is, right? So if God had this other quiddity or mahiyya or essence or whatness, right, other than necessary existence, we'd have to say that he was that only contingently, and it turns out to be that wouldn't be what he actually is. That would just be something about him, but it wouldn't be his whatness, right? It would be an accident rather than the essence. Yeah? So there's the argument, which gets kind of involved and goes on. Well, how do you? So clear enough?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's typically a Vincent kind of complicated and long drawn out argument, right? But he has many worse arguments than that that are harder to understand. I'm not saying worse in the sense that they're wrong or invalid, just that they're so much more complicated and harder. This one is probably the worst that we could fit onto a PowerPoint slide, right? Fruitfully. But there it is. It makes sense enough, I think. Now, what does Ghazali say about it? Yeah. He says, well, the problem is this concept of necessary existent, which according to Ghazali doesn't have any meaning other than that the thing doesn't have a cause, right? And he then says that their proof rests on taking every existing whatness as a real plurality, right, of existence and whatness. And he objects to that by saying that distinction in meaning does not constitute a real plurality. Yeah. So, for example, we're talking about this bottle of water, right? And if I would say, okay, the bottle of water exists and it has an essence. What is it? It's a bottle of water. These two meanings, right, its existence and its essence, don't constitute two things. There's one thing here, right? There's one thing which has two dimensions and two aspects. The fact that it exists and what it is. But that doesn't mean there's two things. So Ghazali is saying this distinction between existence and essence doesn't constitute an ontological distinction and a distinction in reality between separate things so that we can call it a real plurality, right? So, and that's why, since he believes that the philosopher are mistaken in understanding the distinction between essence and existence in that way, right? At least in this context, then he's arguing that their argument here is invalid, right? Because it could be God has an essence and he exists, but that doesn't mean that there are two distinct parts of God, right? That they are separate, distinct things. We have two gods that are stuck together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, right, I think that we can go ahead to the next one. Yeah. Okay. And he goes on and he says, besides that, existence without whatness is unintelligible. So you're telling us that God is existence or has existence, basically that God exists and just is existence, without any whatness. There's not anything conceivable. Right? There's not anything that we're thinking exists. It's just existence. And he says that's unintelligible, right? You can't even think of or conceive of anything which has no whatness. right? And we just have a blankness, right? Something or other, right? And unattached to non-existence is inconceivable. So if you were to say something or other that doesn't exist, that would make sense. Only an existence whose non-existence is supposed is conceivable. Like, for example, if I were to talk about, like the unicorn, which was basically Ibn Sina's own argument, right? Unicorns or Santa Claus. These things are concepts, they're ideas that exist in our mind, right? Not outside of our mind, but they do exist in our mind. And this, when we say they don't exist outside of our mind, that's how we can conceive that. We're not saying that there's a something or other that doesn't exist. We can only even can conceive it or grasp it when we have an idea in mind, even if it's not a real thing, like a unicorn, right? So how could we talk about an existence which has no whatness or reality, right? He says existence is only conceivable in relation to some kind of specific haqiqa, reality, right? And in this case, it's whatness in mahiyya. We can't say that something exists, but it's not anything in particular, right? That doesn't make any sense at all. So he says the supposition is like saying there is existence without an existent. And that's contradictory. Because the existence is the particular mahiyya, right? The thing that does exist. If it were intelligible, then there could be something caused, which, like the first, is an existent without whatness, differing only in having a cause. The only objection to this is that it is in itself unintelligible, and it does not become intelligible by denying a cause. So he's saying, okay, now you're telling us what you've proved, right, through the philosophical proof, which Ghazali mainly agrees with, that there is a being who is not caused, but causes everything else, and creates everything else, right? And then from that you go on to say that this being has no whatness, it only has existence, right? And Ghazali says, just consider if I were to now propose that there was a caused being that has no whatness, right? A regular temporal thing comes and goes but has no whatness. You would say that's unintelligible. Now how does it make it intelligible if I add without a cause? If I say, here is a something or other, not anything in particular that exists, but doesn't have a cause. That's no more intelligible than if I say, here's a something or other, nothing in particular, it does not have a cause. Both of these are inconceivable, unintelligible propositions, right? And he says nothing remains after you deny mahiyya except for just the word existence, right? Because you can't even conceive of existence without as something that exists. Yeah. And then the philosopher reject or respond by saying, well, his being necessary is his whatness. Right? The necessity of God's existence is the only thing there is to what he is. It's just that he exists necessarily. And Ghazali says, well, that's nothing but the denial of the cause. When we say that he is necessary, we're just saying he doesn't need a cause, right? And that's a denial of a certain kind of whatness. That's not a whatness, right? The lack of a cause is just a negation. It doesn't tell you what God is, it just tells you what he doesn't need, right? Denial of the cause of his whatness is entailed in the denial of the cause of God. And then he has this interesting statement here. Let then reality be intelligible so as to be described as having no cause and whose non-existence is inconceivable, since there is no other meaning for necessity except this, right? Basically saying, let God be intelligible. God has a whatness, right? And he exists necessarily and doesn't have a cause, but he has a whatness, and these are involved in his attributes which come later. Ghazali debates with the philosopher of God's power and knowledge and will and so forth, right? And that's the end of discussion 8. So the whole thing ends up turning on, right, the question about whether the distinction between existence and essence is a real distinction or just a conceptual distinction. Yeah. So it looks like here, like the philosopher Ibn Sina uses these two ideas, right, or uses this distinction and these arguments as if it were a real distinction, when according to Ghazali, in fact, it's only a conceptual distinction. And in other places, when Ibn Sina actually makes this distinction and discusses it, he talks about it as if it's only a conceptual distinction also. Okay. And you look tired.
I'm arguing for sure.